The Vrynn had conquered 14 star systems before they learned humility, which was 13 more than most species managed before someone taught them the concept with orbital bombardment. Their homeworld of Vrynthak produced warriors, hunters and survival experts who could endure temperatures that would turn other species into decorative ice sculptures. They wore this reputation like a badge, which was fortunate because they wore very little else, their natural fur coats being quite sufficient for most environmental challenges. So naturally, when the Galactic Cooperative proposed an exchange program, the Vrynn had laughed, not politely, not even behind their hands. They had laughed the way apex predators laugh when prey animals suggest a potluck dinner. The idea that other species, particularly the bizarre hairless creatures called humans, could teach them anything about survival was approximately as likely as a star suddenly deciding to burn cold. Elder Thraken, whose fur had gone silver with age and whose scars had gone legendary with embellishment, stood before the tribal council on Cathara 9. The frozen moon served as their ultimate proving ground, where temperatures routinely dropped to levels that made liquid nitrogen look like a hot beverage. Every Vrynn youth underwent the survival trial here. You went into the wilderness with nothing. You came back stronger, or you did not come back at all. The system had worked for 6,000 years, give or take a few hundred frozen teenagers that nobody talked about at dinner parties. The human arrives today, Thraken announced, his breath crystallizing in the air of the council chamber. Even indoors on Cathara 9, you could see your words hang in front of you like accusations. The council members shifted, their fur rippling with barely concealed amusement. They had seen the images of humans: smooth skin, blunt teeth, no claws worth mentioning. They looked like someone had plucked a Vrynn and then given up halfway through, leaving behind a sad pink compromise of a creature. "Let the furless one observe our ways," Council Member Vex said, her tone dripping with condescension thick enough to bottle. "Perhaps they will learn what true strength means." The human arrived 3 hours later, stepping off the transport shuttle, wearing enough insulated clothing to constitute a personal tent. When the human removed the outer layers in the receiving bay, the Vrynn tried very hard not to stare. They failed, because the human looked exactly as ridiculous as advertised: smooth skin, small frame, and an expression of polite interest that suggested either tremendous courage or tremendous stupidity. The galaxy had not yet determined which. "Thanks for having me," the human said, extending a hand in that bizarre greeting ritual their species favored. Looking forward to learning from the legendary Vrynn survival techniques, Thraken clasped the offered hand, noting how soft it felt. Like touching something that had never known work or hardship. He felt almost guilty about what was to come. "Almost. You honor us with your presence," Thraken replied, meaning approximately none of those words. "Tomorrow 3 of our cubs begin their first solo survival trial. You may observe from the monitoring station." The human nodded, and Thraken could have sworn he saw something flicker in those strange forward-facing eyes. Something that looked uncomfortably like calculation. The storm hit on day 2 of the trial. Not just any storm. The kind of storm that made meteorologists question their career choices and weather satellites file for early retirement. The kind that turned Cathara 9 from merely inhospitable to actively murderous. Wind speeds that could strip fur from flesh. Snow so thick it became a solid white wall. Temperature drops that would make atoms stop vibrating out of sheer depression. The 3 cubs, young Vrynn named Kelth, Mirror and Dax, had barely made it to an ice cave before the full fury hit. The monitoring station tracked their vital signs with increasing alarm. Hypothermia was setting in. Fast. They must endure, Thraken said, though his hand clenched around his ceremonial staff hard enough to make it creak. "It is our way. Your way is going to kill children," the human said flatly from the back of the monitoring room. The temperature in the chamber, already cold, somehow dropped further. "You do not understand our culture," Vec hissed. "Weakness cannot be coddled. They must survive on their own, or you write them off as acceptable casualties while pretending it builds character." The human was already moving toward the equipment lockers. "Great system. Very sustainable. How many cubs do you lose per decade?" Thraken's ears flattened against his skull. "What are you doing?" "Something stupid, probably." The human began pulling out survival gear with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, which seems to be my species' primary contribution to galactic civilization. That and spite. We're very good at spite. You cannot interfere. The survival trial is sacred. Cool story. Tell it to the cubs when they're dead. The human headed for the exit. Or don't, I guess, since they'd be dead. Probably makes the conversation difficult. Thraken should have stopped it. Could have stopped it. The human had no authority here. No right to violate their most sacred tradition. But he found himself frozen, watching as this bizarre alien walked deliberately into a storm that would kill anything stupid enough to challenge it. "Track them both," he finally growled. "If the human dies, we will have a diplomatic incident." "If the human dies," Vec observed dryly, "we will have documentation that we tried to stop them." The human found the cubs 4 hours later, which was either excellent tracking skills or dumb luck. The monitoring station could not tell the difference from satellite imagery alone. The cubs were barely conscious, huddled together in the ice cave, their fur coated with frost. They looked up at the human with confused, dimming eyes. "Right," the human muttered, kneeling beside them. "Nobody panic. Well, panic internally if you want, but externally, we're going to be very calm and very productive." The first thing the human did was start a fire, which seemed impossible given the wind conditions and the fact that there was no wood on an ice moon. But the human had brought chemical fire starters that burned hot enough to melt stone. Within minutes, blessed heat began to fill the cave. The second thing the human did was leave the cave. Kelth tried to call out, but his jaw was shaking too hard to form words. The human returned 20 minutes later, dragging the corpse of a Ketharan snow beast, one of the massive furry predators that somehow thrived in this frozen nightmare. The thing was twice the human's size. It was also very dead, with a clean kill wound to the throat. "Protein," the human announced cheerfully, as if they had not just hunted down an apex predator in a blizzard. "Also fur. We're going to need so much fur." Over the next 6 planetary rotations, as the storm raged with unprecedented fury, the monitoring station watched something that would later be described in Vrynn historical records, with words like impossible, absurd, and typically human. The human butchered the snow beast with a knife and tools fashioned from ice and stone. Every part was used. Meat was cooked and rationed. Bones became structural supports and needles. Sinew became thread. And the fur, that glorious insulating fur, became the human's obsession. The human wove, not quickly, not beautifully, but with the grim determination of someone who had decided that failure was simply not on the agenda. The cubs watched, their hypothermia slowly receding, as the human's fingers worked raw and bleeding, creating something that looked like fabric from strips of beast hide. "What are you making?" Mira finally asked, her voice weak but curious. "Coats," the human replied, not looking up. "Little ones for you 3. Because apparently your natural fur is great until it gets soaked, and then you're just wearing wet carpet. Terrible design. Evolution should be embarrassed. Our ancestors survived. Your ancestors didn't have a human around to point out the design flaws. The human grinned, and there was something slightly unhinged about it. Also, they probably lost a lot of cubs to hypothermia and just didn't talk about it. That's how traditions work. Survivorship bias with extra steps. The human expanded the shelter, using ice blocks cut with laser precision, created ventilation systems that somehow maintained heat while preventing carbon monoxide buildup, built a water collection system that melted snow and filtered it clean, hunted 2 more snow beasts, because apparently once you figured out their behavioral patterns, they were just big, stupid murder cats with terrible situational awareness. The cubs learned despite themselves. They learned how to process hides without tools designed for the task, how to calculate caloric needs and ration accordingly, how to tell stories to pass time and maintain morale, which the human did with dramatic flair and absolutely no shame. And then, the human said, hands gesturing wildly while tending the fire. The captain looked at the alien armada and said, "That's cute. Did you want to surrender now, or after we demonstrate basic physics?" And that's how humanity won the Battle of Proxima with math and audacity. Dax chittered with laughter, a sound that had seemed impossible 6 days ago when he was dying of exposure. In the monitoring station, the Vrynn elders watched in silence that had evolved from outrage to confused to something that might have been respect if they had been willing to admit it. "Look at the shelter construction," Vec whispered, pulling up enhanced imagery. "The thermal efficiency is remarkable. How did the human learn to do that?" "Humans come from a death world," Thraken said quietly. "Old memories stirring. I read their file. Their planet tries to kill them with weather, predators, diseases, and occasionally the ground itself opens up to swallow cities. They survived not because they were strongest or fastest. Then how? They were stubborn and creative, and they refused to accept that anything was impossible." Thraken's tail twitched. "We thought them weak because they have no fur, no claws, no natural weapons. We failed to understand that they made themselves weapons. Every tool is a claw, every shelter is armor, every story is a way to pass knowledge, so the next generation does not have to learn from scratch." On day 6, the storm broke. The rescue team arrived prepared for tragedy. They found instead a thriving camp. The cubs were healthy, alert, and wearing tiny fur coats that would have looked ridiculous if they had not been so obviously functional. The human was teaching them how to weave, all 4 of them sitting around a fire that had been burning continuously for days. "Oh good, rescue," the human said casually. "I was starting to worry we'd run out of snow beast before you arrived. We're down to the last half of number 3. Thraken stepped into the shelter, his experienced eye cataloging everything. The woven mats, the organized storage, the processed meat hanging to dry, the water collection system, the ventilation shafts. The cubs looked healthier than some Vrynn who completed the survival trial under normal conditions. "You violated our sacred tradition," Thraken said, but there was no heat in the words. "Yeah. Well, your sacred tradition was about to produce 3 dead children and a bunch of regrets." The human stretched, joints popping audibly. "I figured you could either be mad at me for saving them or mad at yourselves for letting them die. Seemed like an easy choice. You do not understand. The survival trial teaches strength through adversity. It teaches survivors how to survive," the human interrupted. "The dead ones don't learn anything except regret in their final moments. Survivor bias. You only hear from the ones who made it, so you think the system works." Kelth stepped forward, wearing his tiny woven coat like armor. Elder Thraken, the human, taught us things, not just how to survive, but why. Every choice had a reason. Every action had purpose. "Show me," Thraken commanded. For the next hour, the cubs demonstrated their new knowledge: how to judge snow beast tracks, how to calculate shelter dimensions for thermal efficiency, how to process hides and weave them into fabric, how to maintain fire in impossible conditions, how to ration food for extended survival, how to keep morale high when circumstances were low. Thraken examined a section of woven fur, his claws tracing the tight, even stitches. "This is remarkable work. It's passable work," the human corrected. "I'm a mediocre weaver at best, but mediocre is better than frozen, so we made it work." "How did you learn these skills?" The human shrugged. "Humans have been surviving in hospitable environments for our entire existence. We lived through ice ages with nothing but pointed sticks and attitude. We crossed deserts that would kill you in hours. We sailed across oceans on wooden planks because we were curious what was on the other side." Every human carries in their cultural memory 10,000 generations of ancestors who looked at certain death and said, "But what if we tried anyway?" Vec approached, her demeanor completely changed from 6 days ago. "You made it look easy." It wasn't easy. It was exhausting and terrifying, and there were several moments where I thought we were all going to die. The human's expression turned serious. But giving up wasn't an option. Not while those cubs were depending on me. Humans are really, really bad at giving up. It's kind of our thing. The journey back to the settlement was quiet. The cubs refused to remove their woven coats, even in the heated transport. They stuck close to the human, who had somehow become their pack leader through sheer force of competence and spite. At the council chamber, Thraken addressed the assembled elders. "We must revise our understanding of strength. The Vrynn have always prided ourselves on physical prowess, natural advantages, the gifts our evolution provided. We looked at species like humans and saw weakness because they lacked our natural fur, our claws, our built-in advantages." He held up a section of woven fur. "We failed to understand that advantage is not always something you are born with. Sometimes advantage is something you create. Humans are born vulnerable, so they made themselves invulnerable through knowledge, tools, and the absolute refusal to accept limitations." "So what do you propose?" Vec asked. "I propose we had it backwards. We do not teach the human our survival techniques. The human teaches us theirs. Because surviving when you are naturally equipped for it is admirable. Surviving when everything about your biology says you should die, and doing it anyway through sheer stubborn ingenuity." Thraken's ears flicked with something like admiration. "That is exceptional." The human, standing at the back of the chamber, still wearing borrowed Vrynn cold-weather gear, raised a hand. "Can I go take a hot shower now? Because I smell like the inside of a snow beast's nightmare, and I have frostbite in places I didn't know could get frostbite." "Of course," Thraken said. "And human, thank you. For saving our cubs. For teaching them. For showing us that we still had things to learn." "No problem. Honestly, I just really hate letting kids die. It's a whole thing with my species. We're weird about it." The human paused at the door. "Also, those cubs are great students. Smart, adaptable, quick learners. They're going to be exceptional hunters someday." After the human left, Kelth approached the council, still wearing his woven coat. "Elder Thraken, I have learned more in 6 days with the human than in 6 months of traditional training." "What did you learn?" The young Vrynn considered carefully. "I learned that strength is not about what you have naturally. It is about what you do with what you have." The human had no fur, no claws, no natural advantages. But the human had knowledge, creativity, and determination. And that was enough. That was more than enough. Mira stepped forward. I learned that survival is not about suffering alone. It is about working together, teaching others, building systems that help everyone succeed. The human could have kept us barely alive. Instead, the human made us thrive. Dax, the youngest, spoke last. I learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to accept that something is impossible. The human should have died in that storm. We all should have died. But the human said no, and then made it true through action. Thraken looked at the three cubs, then at the woven fur in his hands. The galaxy had spent centuries categorizing species by their natural advantages. The Vrynn had fur, the Krillians had armor plating, the Theks had venom, and humans had nothing except a brain that refused to quit and hands that turned every problem into a solution. Maybe that was the most dangerous advantage of all. In her quarters, the human finally got that hot shower, standing under water hot enough to steam. Every muscle ached. Every joint protested. But the cubs were alive. That was what mattered. That was always what mattered to humans. Not glory, not proving superiority. Just making sure everyone got home alive, if at all possible, and creating miracles when it was not. The galaxy would learn, slowly, what the Vrynn had learned in 6 days of blizzard. You could have all the natural advantages in the universe. You could be stronger, faster, better equipped by evolution for survival. But when the storms came, when conditions turned impossible, when death seemed certain, you wanted a human on your team, because humans looked at certain death and saw a problem to solve, and they were very, very good at solving problems. Even if the solution involved way too much weaving and questionable decisions made in blizzard conditions, especially then.